This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we are counting on you.
And today we're very pleased to welcome journalist and author Eyal Press. He is a contributor to The New Yorker, The New York Times, and other publications. He's received a very long list of awards that we can't list all of them here, but I will mention the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism, along with many others. I think that's a particularly appropriate one. He is also a fellow at the Type Media Center. Eyal is also the author of 3 books, and we'll be discussing his latest, freshly published book called Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America, published by FSG. We'll also touch on some of the earlier works, which are all well worth reading, especially my favorite, Beautiful Souls from 2012. Eyal, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Dahlia.
I want to start off by asking, what is dirty work for you? And just to explain that, at first glance, when I heard the title, I thought it referred maybe to people who do the lowest level jobs in society, the invisibles, the kind of people that Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about in her classic Nickel and Dimed. But your work refers to people that I thought of as being squeezed in the middle of a sort of moral pyramid. Can you explain the concept, and do you agree with my description, or would you characterize it otherwise?
Yeah, I think so. There's a colloquial expression, dirty work, that I think most people will assume is the subject of my book, and that's just sort of, thankless, difficult, low-paying work, and it could refer to anything from a bouncer, doing the tough job of getting, managing the rowdy crowd at a club, to people cleaning hotel rooms. And that's the colloquial expression, but it's not what I mean by dirty work. It's not actually how I define it. And my book is actually sort of the starting point for the book is a sociological essay that defined dirty work differently. And this essay was published in 1963. It was written by Everett Hughes. And Everett Hughes was a sociologist at the University of Chicago who, after World War II in 1947, spent a semester teaching abroad. And the place he taught was Frankfurt, Germany. And Hughes had been in Germany before the rise of Nazism, and then he sort of stopped going and fell out of touch with the folks he'd known. But when he came back to Germany, he was very curious to find out how the people he'd known, most of whom were intellectuals, journalists, what he called good people, not fascists, not Nazis, how they had made it through this whole period and how they were going to talk about what had just happened, which was the genocide of the Jews, of course, and of other groups that were considered racially impure. And so Hughes starts engaging people on this subject. He finds out mostly that the good people don't want to talk about it at all. But one night he goes to the home of an architect, and he brings it up. What do you make of what just happened here? And the architect very quickly says, well, I'm ashamed for my people whenever I think about it. This is a terrible thing. But the Jews, they were a problem, he goes on to say, and proceeds to kind of cast the problem of the Jews as something that needed to be taken care of. Now, of course, the way the Nazis took care of it was not the right thing, and of course he's ashamed of what they did, but something had to be done. And Hughes sort of keeps hearing variations of this on the one hand, on the other hand answer, and out of this comes this essay, Good People and Dirty Work. And at the core of this concept, so dirty work as Hughes conceives of it, is unethical activity that is delegated to others and then sort of conveniently disavowed by the good people, what he calls the good people. But the crucial thing about this is that it has a tacit mandate from society. In other words, people may be ashamed of it if you bring it up to them, but they're also perfectly happy not to ask too many questions about it and to have someone else kind of take care of the problem, as it were. And so that is what I mean by dirty work. Now, you may wonder, and listeners may wonder, well, wait a minute, this was Nazi Germany. This was an extreme example. Why apply this concept elsewhere? And the reason is that Hughes very explicitly said in this essay that this dynamic exists in all societies. This sort of idea of dirty work, morally unpleasant tasks that are sort of hidden and disavowed, even though there's a kind of tacit mandate for them. And I actually think dirty work is even more relevant in democratic societies than in a totalitarian country like Nazi Germany, because the people in Germany really didn't have much of a say over whether this dirty work would unfold or not. In a place like the United States, you do have a say. So the connection between the quote-unquote good people or society at large and the dirty work that goes on behind closed doors in their name is all the stronger and all the more relevant, I think.
But what's interesting about your book is that you're focusing not as much on the good people that would be in the position of that architect, who kind of says, well, he didn't have to do it himself, but he sort of tacitly supports it, even though he's sort of ashamed of it, but just doesn't want to know about it. Your book is much more about the people who are actually doing it. Why are they doing it?
Right. And so that's very true. And I would say that the book is addressed in some ways to the quote unquote good people. And I think most readers will think of themselves that way. Why shouldn't they? But Hughes referred to the dirty workers as agents of the good people. And I think that's very much the message of my book. So I focus on the workers, and I'll speak more specifically about who I'm talking about. People who carry out drone strikes in the United States, or people who work in the mental health wards of America's jails and prisons, which are the largest mental health institutions in the United States. These are, in my book, the agents of all of us. They are doing work that society has that are necessary because the prevailing social order has kind of led the United States to fight its wars this way, or to sequester people and confine them in jails and prisons. And I wanted to tell the story, to get inside those worlds, to sort of give readers a sense of what the dirty work is and what the people who do it see and undergo. I decided to write the book through the stories of the people doing the work.
To what extent would you say that this dirty work is the result of cultural issues, the way things are done, as you said it, rather than, the circumstances, the material circumstances, the social circumstances? To what extent is it structural, and to what extent is it cultural?
I think it's both, but and maybe I can circle back and a little bit address what Dahlia asked me about, sort of how this work is organized. In my view, the book is very much about inequality, and there's an argument in it. The argument is that dirty work is not carried out by society's elites, by people who are privileged. The work itself is degrading. It's stigmatized. It encumbers the people who do it with all kinds of moral and psychological burdens, and not surprisingly, more elite people who have the greatest choices and opportunities don't do this work. And not only don't they do it, they don't even see it. So this work is carried out in institutions or places that are convenient, that are geographically isolated, that are often behind walls, prisons and jails, for example, or that are walled off by secrecy rules, like the drone wars are. And so the way that dirty work is organized and who ends up doing this work very conveniently leaves it in the hands of the people with fewer choices and opportunities. Another example in the book that I write about at length is industrial slaughterhouses. Most Americans know that the meat in their and poultry in their supermarkets comes from these sort of industrial factory farms and these slaughterhouses where the animals are treated brutally and the workers are also treated brutally. Very few Americans ever see what goes on inside those places. Not surprisingly, they are geographically isolated. They're far away from population centers, most of these farms and slaughterhouses. And the people who end up doing the work, the cutting up and the killing of the animals, are by and large people of color, immigrants, often undocumented immigrants. So it's all kind of out of sight, out of mind. And in this way, I think Dirty Work, I use Dirty Work as a prism to tell a larger story about America and how all kinds of morally objectionable practices end up being removed from sight, removed from popular discourse, even as society is very much operating with an assumption that those things will go on.
Tell us about some of these personal stories. One of the things I think that your main characters, and this is a very character-driven book, have in common is that most of them, I think, come from very difficult backgrounds where they have either grown up in poverty or abuse or, other real tribulations. Do you think is that not you're implying that it's not a coincidence. Can you expand on why that is?
Yes. So again, I think that let me give a sense of one of the people in the book, Harriet Kryskovsky. Harriet is in the first section of the book, which is about the mental health wards of America's jails and prisons. And I look in particular at a prison in Florida called the Dade Correctional Institution. And at Dade, Harriet gets a job there because she needs work. It's after the Great Recession in the United States. So after 2008, jobs are hard to come by. They're really hard to come by in Florida, which also had a real estate bubble and a tourism bubble that burst. And Harriet has two kids at the time. Her husband's out of work. They're kind of surviving on a combination of whatever income she can earn and help from family and help from the state. She lands a job at Dade. And she works at in the mental health unit of the prison. And she quickly discovers that there are abuses going on, that some of the security guards are withholding meals from some of the prisoners, that they are verbally and sometimes physically abusing them and assaulting them. And as the reader discovers, Harriet sort of becomes troubled enough by this that she raises a question about it with her supervisor at the prison. And when she does this, she gets a message very quickly that her job is to get along with security, not to challenge security. And this is an issue that confronts all mental health attendants who work in jails and prisons, in correctional settings, because they are, after all, in an environment where their own safety depends on getting along with security, right? She's a woman in an all-male prison. She's running a group therapy session. She may be in a rec yard with 200 men.
Those were harrowing stories to read as a woman, actually.
They were harrowing to hear about. And
probably for anybody. Yeah, not just.
Yeah, and when Harriet sort of challenges what's going on, even a little bit, she starts seeing that the guards disappear when she's doing her work, that they leave her alone. On one occasion, she actually is physically assaulted. She's very frightened. And so she learns not to say anything. Like the other people on the mental health staff, don't challenge security. Well, then she gets to work one day and she hears about what happened to a prisoner named Darren Rainey. And Rainey was in a shower, she hears, and he fell down and he died. And what she discovers is that this was not an accident. This was not a heart attack. This was a torture chamber. The shower, the water flow and the temperature of the water was controlled from the outside by the guards who put mentally ill prisoners in there to punish them. They did it on numerous occasions, I discovered, to numerous different people. And when they did it to Rainey, he fell. We don't know why exactly. It could be that the steam built up and he lost consciousness. It could be that he was trying to get out of the way of the water. But whatever the case, when his body was found, it was covered in burns. And he died a gruesome death, a death that was covered up, and that none of the mental health staff at the prisons said a word about. They did not report it to the newspapers. They did not report it to outside agencies. The only reason we know about the death is that another prisoner leaked word of it eventually to the Miami Herald. But why didn't the staff say anything? Well, they didn't say anything because they were afraid. And they were in this kind of morally compromised, dirtying position, which as I say, is now a structural reality in what are the largest mental health institutions in the United States for the staff. Because on the one hand, you have an obligation to attend to your patients. On the other hand, you need to curry favor with security. So what if there's a conflict between those two things? Well, the conflict ends up playing out in Harriet's life in that she falls in. She doesn't say anything. She keeps silent, but she falls into a depression. She loses her hair. Her hair falls out. She basically becomes haunted and traumatized by her own complicity, which she feels is her own complicity in this system of cruelty and degradation. She eventually does leave the prison, stop working there, and yet even years later, this haunting experience has stayed with her. And this is an example of what I referred to earlier when I said that dirty workers carry these kind of moral and emotional wounds that really belong to society, but that society doesn't hear much about. So it's for Harriet to know and recall the barbaric mistreatment that she witnessed and felt caught up in. But Dade is right next to Miami, and no one in Miami who doesn't work in corrections has to know anything about it. And indeed, when I was reporting the story, no one did know much about it. They just sort of carried on with their lives. And so again, I posit that, stories like Harriet's play out every day in hundreds of places. But there's this sort of convenient separation in which society, the people who dirty their hands are hidden and tend to be people with fewer choices and opportunities. Very few elite psychiatrists work in prisons. This is low-paying work. It's stigmatized work. They just don't do it. So it falls to people like her.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the dirty workers is that there's always one of the conflicts is that the morally objectionable practices are always a two-way street, right? They inflict those morally objectionable practices on other people, and morally objectionable practices are inflicted on them. And as you described, this is a conflict that they have to live with, and not always successfully. And my question to you, how do you understand it? How is it sustainable? How does it not affect larger society? How does it not trickle up to the more convenient parts of society, which are the majority, as you described?
I mean, I think the division of labor is a big part of that, and I think concealment is a big part of that. If you can keep things hidden, America generally is such an unequal society, cleaved by vast class disparities, racial disparities. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone, I think, that the dirty work in America would reflect that, would be arranged in a way that where those with power do and see very little of it, even when they benefit from it, and those without power dirty their hands in it and sort of, in a sense, bear the burden of it. I will say that you're very right that the people in the book, I sort of, they're gray actors. They're people who get caught up in and sometimes do awful things. But implicit in the book is that they are also in some sense victims, because larger circumstances have pushed certain people into these roles and absolved others of having to do them.
Well,
Now,
sorry.
yeah. No, go ahead, Dahlia.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, I really want to pick up on that point. I mean, I would say it's not terribly implicit. I would think to me, it seemed like a rather outstanding part of the book that the people who are in these jobs, because in many ways, because of their station in life, end up very damaged. And in fact, you spend a lot of time, especially I think in the chapter on drone killings, you spent a lot of time talking about moral injury. And it wasn't just Harriet losing her hair. They all suffered in many ways. Can you tell us about the impact that this has on them, these kinds of jobs, and what is that moral injury, which is a clinical term?
Yes. So moral injury is quite central to a lot of the stories in the book. You're right. And in the case of drone operators, there's been a very expansive conversation in the United States and probably in Israel as well about PTSD and PTSD linked to combat and warfare and violence. But PTSD is generally in the United States talked about and diagnosed in the military and also in broader society as something that is caused by exposure to life-threatening events, roadside bomb, or a loud explosion, seeing a comrade fall, or seeing having one's own life threatened in such a way that this sort of fear response becomes wired into a person. And PTSD is very extensive among veterans coming back from America's recent wars, because the wars were counterinsurgency, they were messy, there was so much of this. But what about drone operators? I mean, they don't actually enter the combat zone. So why are they burning out? Why are they? Why is it that the military was having such a hard time keeping people in the program to do this kind of work? And what I discovered in reporting on it and meeting imagery analysts and sensor operators in the drone program, and then going to bases and talking to psychologists who work on these bases, is that they suffer from a different kind of injury. And it's the injury of watching over and over again, sometimes in very intimate detail, really morally troubling things. In some cases, that can flow from decisions they make or don't make. Right. So, should we hit that building? You're far away from it, and you're part of the decision-making chain that decides, yes, we should. But then you see or you learn that actually the target wasn't there, or in addition to the target, there was a family there, or there were civilians there. You watch this play out over and over again, or you decide not to fire, and then you see soldiers on the ground who die. And this sense of responsibility of, I did the morally wrong thing, and I could have done something else. This becomes the type of wound. It's a psychological and moral wound that is rooted in witnessing or doing things that go against one's own principles and beliefs. And this is true of the drone operators who I describe at length in the book. Again, they don't have this fear response. They don't have this, what would traditionally be called PTSD in the military sense, but they have these moral and psychological wounds that echo with the literature on moral injury. And moral injury has mostly been discussed and written about in relation to the military in recent years, even though the military itself does not officially, I think as of this point, it's still quite a controversial term within the military. But it's starting to spread beyond the military. So you're starting to have people talk about the moral injury that healthcare workers may experience. And I take that concept and actually apply it to dirty workers in various different ways, because I think that, again, these are ethically troubling things. And certainly not everyone who does them is troubled ethically. But I think, that there's a very real question of what happens to a person who is placed in such a position over and over again.
Yeah, it's not the first time in history that this has happened. Modern capitalist societies always had to rely to a certain extent on dirty workers. And I'm thinking about not just Nazi Germany, but also, slave traders and child laborers during the Industrial Revolution in 18th century England, etc. What do you think is the particular relevance of this notion, of these stories, to 21st century America? And if so, what are really the modalities where it plays out?
I mean, I think the history really fascinates me, and you mentioned slave traders, and that to me is really captures what I think are the key dynamics of dirty work. Because in the United States, the domestic slave trade was a major reason that slavery spread and thrived for as long as it did, moving particularly to what was the Cotton Belt, as tobacco farmers who owned plantations and further north, sold slaves to cotton plantations in the South. And what was so interesting to me in reading about slave traders is that you wouldn't be surprised that abolitionists and opponents of slavery thought these were lowly, horrific people doing society's dirty work, doing the South's dirty work. But what's more striking is that slave traders were also vilified within the South by slavery's supporters and defenders. So the idea was, plantation owners are gentlemen. They treat slaves well, but the slave trader is this filthy and morally disreputable person who's just in it for the profit. So even as, it's obvious looking historically, and was obvious at the time, that slave traders were not just condoned, they were relied on, and not just in the South, but by the entire United States, whose economy was, driven by slavery and by cotton for such a long time. And yet the slave traders were vilified. They were people took pains to criticize them, including authors of books defending slavery. And I think that's really telling, because again, it speaks to this kind of, on the one hand, I'm ashamed. On the other hand, someone has to do this, not me, but someone. And as extreme as that example may seem to contemporary ears, I actually think that in the 21st century, to bring the story up to date, we have even more sophisticated ways to conceal and remove from sight things that are morally objectionable. And actually that's a running theme in the book, that this is actually one of the markers of quote unquote civilization. So we have more civilized warfare, warfare that is, that seems clean, as drone strikes do. They're described as surgical. They're described, as sort of this new technocratic, bloodless form of war. But of course, war is not bloodless. And so, I think in the 21st century, and as we move forward, I don't think dirty work will disappear. I think the mechanisms of concealment will become more refined and sophisticated.
You also write that, in passing, because I'm assuming it's a relatively new addition to the introduction, that the COVID pandemic brought some of them to the fore, that brought down this system of concealment.
Certainly the meatpacking industry.
Yeah. So, what do you think it will do to the way that the American public is aware of these issues, of these workers, and of the deeply problematic way in which the system operates?
Well, I think the pandemic, I think COVID in the United States did significantly um, expand and heighten the awareness of the entire society on sort of dependent classes of hidden labor. Who the people sheltering at home were, Microsoft workers and software engineers and day traders for Wall Street, for banks. The people who were called the essential workers, who were driving buses and delivering packages and delivering food to people's doors, were mostly manual laborers who get paid less and who were putting their lives on the line, doing jobs they needed and got because that's what they could get. These weren't all bad jobs, but what we called essential work, you could see there was a kind of class divide, and the non-essential work that could be done from home tended to be, more of society's more privileged classes.
Let's face it, a lot of people like that said things like, actually, COVID wasn't that bad. We got to hang out at home in our nice houses and spend time with our families. It was like we're talking about radically different experiences.
Completely. And so I think that, in that sense, the pandemic sort of put society under the microscope and showed, wow, look at this division of labor. Look how it plays out. Look who is risking their lives. Look who isn't. But I think my book is trying to expand that conversation and say, it's not just that we have this divide and that some people take physical risks at work that more privileged people don't have to take, like exposing themselves to disease, exposing themselves to injury. It's also that we have a moral divide that mirrors and reflects that inequality. And so we have a class of workers who dirty their hands doing society's dirty work in these kind of walled off places. And then we have a class of people who are very removed from it. One of the key ways I think that I was asked earlier, how does this sustain itself? Well, the elites who occasionally do get glimpses of this world, there'll be a terrible abuse in a prison that gets into the newspapers or gets onto the nightly news. At that point, there's an easy villain. And the easy villain is, the security guard, the individuals who are involved, who did this dirty work, as opposed to the system, the larger system that created them, the taxpayers who fund the prisons, the Department of Corrections that, hums along and no one at the top is held accountable because it's all blamed on the people at the bottom. That's a fundamental dynamic that I think perpetuates this. So even though there has been an expanded awareness, I don't know how far it's gotten.
I want to go, I guess I was riveted by the stories of what these people go through who are working in these jobs. And many of them in your telling go through some sort of crisis, like we said, the moral injury, which has an effect, something like PTSD. And I want to relate it a little bit to your earlier book, Beautiful Souls, which in my mind is a beautiful book, which looked at individuals who broke with their communities and took a path of dissent, resisting participation in terrible things, even atrocities, moral violations, sometimes even in the heat of battle. I see a connection between these two themes, and I'm wondering if you can help explain what it might be.
There's definitely a connection, Dahlia, and thank you for the kind words about Beautiful Souls. That book was, I think both books deal quite centrally with, in some ways, a similar question, which is how do individuals navigate morally treacherous situations where they may have to do things that go against their beliefs, their conscience, their principles. But there are also differences. So one sort of obvious difference is the subjects. In Beautiful Souls, I'm writing about exceptional individuals who break ranks, who don't dirty their hands. And in this book, I'm writing about conflicted insiders who go along. And the reasons they go along are not always nefarious, but they do dirty their hands. And I think that when I finished Beautiful Souls, I was drawn to and interested in the folks who sort of got swept along and weren't able to break ranks. There's a particular story actually in Beautiful Souls, in the section of the book that's set in the Balkans, where I spent an evening talking to 18 and 19. Well, they weren't 18 and 19 anymore, but guys in their 40s who described what happened when the Balkan Wars erupted and how they were kind of told, go fight here, go do this, go do that. They ended up fighting their neighbors. And they were 18, 19 years old, and went from having sort of fairly conventional lives to participating in a war that led to ethnic cleansing, to genocide, to all kinds of atrocities. And I felt in these stories that I heard the moral injury, the horror, not just that these folks had perpetrated, but also that they'd experienced themselves from having gotten swept along in this, from something that they didn't fully understand. And again, I'm not absolving them of responsibility for the choices they made, but I don't think these were easy choices for anyone in that situation. And I think that similarly in Dirty Work, I'm looking at people who like the chapter of the book on prison guards. There are going to be people who sort of begin that chapter thinking, these guys they're all part of a violent system. They willingly participate in it. They don't need to work in it. So they're all to blame. And they don't deserve any sympathy. And that's a fair reading if you have it. But I think what the chapter shows is that, who ends up applying for jobs as prison guards? Where are prisons in this country? Again, it's not society's elites. It's small towns. It's poorer areas. The number of women and the number of people of color who work in corrections has risen dramatically in recent decades, alongside of mass incarceration. So you have this system where, in effect, there are two sets of victims. There are the people who are subjected to brutal, the incarcerated people who are subjected to brutal conditions, but also the jailers who are in a system that degrades and dehumanizes, I think, everyone in it to some extent. That's the sort of thrust of the book, and I think that again, I'm sure that I could have looked for the dissenters in all of these stories. But I wanted to shift the focus to the folks who, the gray actors who go along.
We have like 1,000 more questions and no more time, but I just want to make the observation that in life, I find that it's very easy to be angry at the people doing the bad things, right? Especially as a critical person who thinks about society critically. I want to be angry at the slave traders always and only angry at them. But I think that your book really says that we just don't have that luxury. It's not necessarily the effective way to understand society. We have to see a lot of more complexity, which is what comes out in your book, to my mind. So that's just a comment. It's not a question,
and also looking at the bad people, quote unquote, shifts the focus from the way society operates.
I thank you for that. I think that if there's one thing I would love for readers to grapple with, it's, what role do I play in this? It's very easy to condemn others, and maybe that's the condemnation is fair. But the book engages Primo Levi and others who have written in deep and sophisticated ways about the difficulty and the complexity of judging. And I hope that this book leads people not just to cast a critical eye at others, but to think critically about themselves.
All right. Eyal Press, journalist and author, author of the newly published book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America, just published by FSG. Thank you very much for appearing on this show.
Thank you so much.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and our producer, Ariel Cohen. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has well over 600 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook, as well as follow me, Dalia, and the podcast on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.